This is a short introduction to XHTML and XML. XHTML stands for Extensible HTML, and XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. XML is a markup language much like HTML. It was designed for data transport, not for data rendering. The tags are not predefined. You define your own tags. It is designed to be self-descriptive. It is not a replacement for HTML. Let's look at an example. This is a file that contains XML coded information. As you see, the very first line identifies the file as an XML file. What follows, and it's shown over here in bolder font, is information, data that are to be transported or handed to an application or to another user for whatever purposes. As you see, all of this information is enclosed within tags. The tags mark the different parts of the data and provide information about what this data is. The tags, as you see here, they can be anything that you want. They do have the style of the tags of HTML with opening brackets and closing brackets. However, they're not keywords that are predefined anywhere in any specification. So you see over here, we have a tag called book. It is only used to mark a piece of data, but otherwise book itself is not a reserved keyword in any XML specification. In the same way, we use tags freely over here that are made up. They're only made up for our convenience to understand what this data is supposed to be. A browser will not understand this tag and will ignore it. So here we have a tag that is made up again called bookstore, and there is a closing tag over here. This identifies some particular segment of data which contains subsegments, and within its segment you have different types of data that make up the segment. So we have a bookstore which consists of books. Here is a book right here, and then there is another book right here. And this is the title of the first book, this is the author, this is the year and the price, and so on for the next segment. Now, let's see what would happen if we try to render this file on a browser. To render this file on a browser, we save it with an extension XML, .xml. That identifies it to the browser as an XML file. So now we loaded this file onto the browser, and this is how this browser, Chrome in particular, displays this file in its default settings. It inserted a message over here telling us that there is no style information associated with it, and so the browser is displaying this file in its default scheme. Now, notice that I can expand these or collapse them as I like. One thing to note is that the browser is displaying all these pieces that look like tags. That is because this file has not been identified as an HTML file, but instead it has been identified as a XML file. So up here, we did not have an HTML tag. We had an XML tag. That is why the browser is actually displaying these pieces that otherwise they would be considered tags. Just for the sake of an example, let me explain myself. So let's say that I change this to HTML, okay, and that I pretend that this is going to be an HTML file. And so I'm going to open a new file now, and I'm going to paste the same information but with a different tag. So I have an HTML tag here. I'm pretending that this is actually HTML. And now I'm going to save this as my test, and I'm going to give it an HTML extension. And save it. Now let's render this file. So this is the rendering of this file as an HTML file. With the HTML extension, and of course with the HTML tag, it is interpreting it as an HTML, and as you see, everything that was in brackets would be considered a tag, which no longer makes sense to the browser if it is supposed to interpret it as HTML, and so it ignores it. So back to our example, this is what an XML file looks like. Data that is tagged to communicate what it means. Now, one thing to notice here is that the data, the actual data that is in the black font, is only a very small part of this file. All of the other stuff, the tags that we have used, are a big chunk of this file, and it is only there and taking a lot of space just for the purpose of tagging. Another important thing to observe is that every tag has a closing counterpart. So going back to our presentation, XML is a markup language, much like HTML, but it was designed only for data transport, not for data display. So it marks the data to tell whoever the data is communicated to what this data is, what parts it's consisting of, and tag the data for that purpose. The tags are not there to provide any directives for display purposes. The tags are not predefined. You can define your own tags. There are no specific tags to use for whatever jobs you want to do for marking data. You make up your own tags as long as you have an opening and a closing one. XML is designed to be self-descriptive, and it is not a replacement for HTML. Again, because HTML is about rendering data, it's telling a browser how to display data, whereas XML was designed for the purpose of transporting data or storing data. The focus of XML is on describing the data and marking what the data is. HTML was designed to specify how data should be displayed, and its focus is on how data looks. The basics of XML syntax. As I said earlier, all XML elements must have a closing tag. XML tags are case sensitive, so the closing tag must be of the same letter case as the opening tag. Elements must be properly nested. This means that if you open a tag and then before you close that one, you open another one, the second one has to be closed first and then the other one. Example, let's say over here I have a book tag. Could I go and do this? Take the book tag and put it here. I can't. The reason is that this tag has been opened and it's closing here. You cannot close the book tag before you close this one, since this one comes after the book tag. XML documents must have a root element. In this case, the bookstore is a root element that contains everything. XML attribute values must be quoted, unlike HTML, where you can get away with not quoting values. For XML, you have to quote attribute values. And with XML, white space is preserved, unlike HTML, which ignores it. These are basic differences between the two. I would like now to turn to a subject that I'm only going to provide as an introduction here, but really more needs to be said about style sheets and maybe JavaScript later on in order to understand how it works. But if you noticed earlier, the browser was telling us that there was no style information that was defined in this XML file, and so it was displaying the file in its own default style. So with XML, it's possible to describe how you want information to be rendered, and that is done with XSLT, or the Extensible Stylesheet Language Transformations. XSLT provides styling directives for XML documents. With XSLT, you can render an XML document like you do with HTML. Here is an example. In this example code, you have an XML file in which styling information or styling directives have been provided. In this particular case, we specify that the body is going to be styled in Arial font, size 11, and with a certain background color. XHTML. XHTML stands for Extensible Hypertext Markup Language. It is almost identical to HTML, but it is a stricter and cleaner version of HTML. XHTML is HTML defined as an XML application. So XHTML is used to describe web pages using HTML tags, but follows the strict syntax of XML, which is that every tag requires a corresponding closing tag, case sensitivity, and the like. So you might say, if XML says that all tags must have an opening and closing tag, what about the break, the horizontal line, and the image, which are standalone tags and they do not have an opening and a closing tag? Well, in that case, what you do for these so-called empty tags, you have to reformat them in this way. So you see, the closing bracket is preceded with a slash. So you have to reformat them in this way for them to work. It's strange, but You could also do this break and then closing break tag with nothing in between, and that would still work. But this is the preferred way of doing things. And that is our quick introduction to X documents.